Hey everyone, and welcome to SLO City Church at home, online, wherever you are. My name is Brent, and I'm humbled to be one of the pastors here at SLO City Church. We are so excited about the many things that are happening, continue to happen in the life of our church, from groups to service opportunities. If you have not jumped in, leaned into the life of the church, I would encourage you to do so. Make sure you click the link in this YouTube video. You also go to slowcity.church/events to find everything that's happening, everything that's going on in the life of the church. We're all in this together. Nobody's perfect. Everyone's welcome. We believe that change and life transformation is possible because there's hope for everyone. For everyone. What is something that has been transformational in your life? What have you run into that has changed everything, that has changed things about you, about your heart, your mind, your soul, your relationships? I have found that generosity is transformational. Generosity is transformational. Have you ever experienced the transformational power of generosity? Have you ever been the recipient of radical generosity? About 5.5 years ago, my family and I were planning our move to San Luis Obispo, and we sold pretty much everything, and we marked out the long drive across the country, marking our stops in Kansas and in Moab, Utah, and we were planning, we were ready for the trip. And right before the trip, a couple days up before the trip, we were at a friend's house, and they kind of threw a makeshift party for us, and we ate good food and we told great stories. And then there was this moment where they pulled our family in the middle of the room and they put their hands on our shoulders and they just prayed for us. And it was just this powerful night that we were surprised by. And as the night wore down, we made our way out to our car and we were about to say goodbye to Trevor and Cindy, the couple who had hosted this party and this special night before we moved across the country. And I'll never forget this moment when Trevor and Cindy stood before us and they said, "Hey, what are you guys driving out to SLO?" And Jen and I looked at each other and we were like, "Well, our 2006 Toyota Sienna. We're driving out the Sienna. We got a topper for it. It's going to be incredible." And they said, "You can't drive that out there." We said, "Well, this is all we've got, and it's been steady and sturdy, and it's got 300,000 miles on it, but we're ready for it." And they said, "You can't drive that out to San Luis Obispo." And Trevor took Cindy's hand, and with tears in his eyes, they said, "We've been talking and we've been praying and we want to give you our car. We're taking care of everything. We're taking care of all the papers and all the transfers and all the insurance. This is our gift to you." Have you ever been the recipient of radical generosity where someone gave you something out of the kindness and goodness of their heart that you didn't earn, that you didn't deserve? We were just given a car. Man, that generosity marked us. It was humbling. It was moving. It was transformational. It caused gratitude. It caused all of these feelings. Have you ever been the recipient of radical generosity? And on the flip side, have you ever been on the giving end of generosity? I love what St. Francis of Assisi says. He says, "It is in giving that we receive." It is in giving that we receive. Last year, during our Hope for One campaign, we came around 20 to 25 families in dire need. And a dad in our church who was relatively new to church, new to faith, new to spiritual formation and all these things, wrote in and sent me an email and shared about his experience. And he said, "I cannot think of something more valuable than giving our time, our money, our energy, our love, and support to these families who have little to nothing." He said, "I have to tell you, I got to see my kids engaged in serving others and the joy that they experienced in serving. They were moved, we were moved by the act of buying and delivering groceries to families with kids their same age." He said, "I'll never forget, and we were struck by how fulfilling it was to spend more money than we had planned on giving dignity and value to those who are often forgotten in our city. We've never done anything like it. We were blessed beyond measure. It is transformational." Have you ever been on the receiving end or the giving end of generosity? It changes things. Serving, giving our time, our talent, our money, our attention. Generosity is transformational. And it changes things, doesn't it? It is powerful for the recipient and the giver. And yet, it's difficult to practice. Isn't generosity a difficult habit to install into our life? You and I live in a world that is saturated with marketing. We are saturated and consumed with getting. We are often consumed with the things that we can consume, with the things that we might be able to require or hoard and save and take, with the money that we can possibly earn and the views to gain. All that we live in a world of consumption and oriented not necessarily on giving, but on getting. So today, in week 4 of our habit series, we're going to talk about developing a habit of generosity. We're talking about developing a habit of generosity, and we're talking about how we live generously in a world that's often about what we can get and what we can take. Now, did you know that in all of Scripture, there are around 500 verses on prayer, encouraging us to pray? Now, that seems really clear and really good. There's a lot of verses on prayer encouraging us to have this conversation with God. There are about 500 verses that encourage us to have faith or to believe, right? You've got to believe in God, to pray to God. I get that maybe. And so there are 500 verses on prayer, 500 verses on belief or faith. Did you know that there are over 2,000 verses on giving, on money, on generosity? Why? Why are the biblical authors, why are the writers, these men and prophets, priests, and writing and encouraging generosity and giving? Why are they writing about money and our stuff and our time and our treasure and our 2,000 times? It's a lot. Why is God so interested in generosity? Why? Because, number one, God is a giver. I want you to hear that. At the very core, at the very character, the very nature of God, He is a giver. There is this God who makes and creates and shares and blesses all of creation, right? John 3:16, for God so loved the world that He gave His only Son, that whoever believed in Him would not perish. God is a giver. James 1:17 says, whatever is good and perfect is a gift coming down to us from God our Father, who created all the lights in the heavens. He never changes. Why is God so interested in giving? Because it's at the heart of who He is. He's a giver. God is a giver. And number 2, God knows that money can take. Money can take. Money can consume us. Money can lure us and tempt us and own our thoughts, can saturate our hearts. Money can take things from us. It can give us a lot, but it can take a lot. And then number 3, generosity grows faith. Generosity grows faith. I had a mentor who shared the power of generosity in this way. He said, generosity honors God, draws us closer to God, heals us of materialism, and forms us more into the likeness of Christ. I want to just talk about those for a minute. Generosity honors God, draws us closer to God, heals us of materialism, and turns us, forms us, transforms us to look more and more like Jesus. Generosity honors God. We're going to talk about generosity today. You're going to hear it. We're going to talk about giving. We're going to talk about money. We're going to talk about all these things because ultimately generosity, how we handle our time, talent, and treasure, it honors God. When we are generous, it is an act of worship and recognition that everything that we have is a gift from God. That every breath I breathe is a gift from God. That every bit of food, every bit of comfort, every level of blessing is a gift from God. 2 Corinthians 9:13 says, so your generosity will prove your obedience. It honors God. Our generosity proves our obedience and our trust in God. Proverbs 14:31 says, whoever oppresses a poor man insults his maker, but he who is generous to the needy honors him. It honors God to give. Number 2, generosity also draws us closer to God. You know this, but whatever you invest in is what you are interested in. What you and I spend our time and our money on is often what we think about, what we meditate about, what I value, and what I watch closely. What I give time, talent, treasure, money, attention to is the aim of my heart. It's true. Golf can become this god. You can just think about it all the time when you put your time and your money. Golf isn't bad, right? I have this sneakerhead friend who spends on average about $350 a month on new shoes. And this friend, like, I love him. He just thinks about shoes. He studies shoes. I'm not judging it, but he is very close. It draws him close to his shoes. Some of our subscriptions can lure us to think about the next shows. Netflix, Hulu, HBO Max, that ESPN login can be this lure and can dictate your schedule. Our greatest investment of our time and our money, if it is on a team, if it's on gaming, if it's on the next kitchen remodel, if it is on kids' sports, that's where your heart's going to be. It's going to draw your time. It's going to draw you into. You're going to be more passionate about kids' sports than anything else. If that's what you're spending time, your closeness will follow. And the same is true in our relationship with God. Generosity can draw us closer to God. Deuteronomy 14:23 says, the purpose of tithing, the purpose of giving 10% of everything that you make is to teach you always to put God first in your life. And Jesus taught in Matthew 6 that your heart will be where your treasure is. Your heart will follow where your treasure is, where your time is put, where your talent, where your treasure is put. So, generosity has the power to draw us closer to God. And in so doing, it has the power to break and heal us of materialism. Materialism is to consider our possessions or our physical comforts as more important than spiritual values. I'm going to say that again. Materialism is to consider our material possessions, our physical comforts as more important than our relationship with God, than our spiritual values. And materialism can creep into our hearts, our minds, our lives, right? Money can give us, and let me just say, money can give us some amazing things, and it can do some amazing things, but money can also take, can't it? It can take away the ability of being content and at peace. The fear of not having enough money can grip a person and take away peace. It can bring on real anxiety. The possibility and temptation of making more money can actually take and steal a person's convictions. You can go like, I once had these convictions, but now I could maybe make some more money, and so those convictions don't matter as much anymore. Money can lure us into comparison, into judgment, into just like this greed. It can create all of these things. It can take our time. It can take our worship. It can take our attention. How are we going to do all this stuff? How are we going to go on this vacation? Money can be this obsessive thing that we fall into. Materialism. It's not evil. Money isn't evil. But the love of money is the root of all evil. Matthew 6:24, Jesus says, you cannot serve both God and money. Why does Jesus say that? Because money can be a god in our life. Money can be the thing that we idolize and worship and think about and come to and say, please, I know you're going to give me a sense of identity, money. Money, you can give me a sense of love. You can make me feel more important. You can give me self-worth. You can give me purpose, money, if I come to money. You can't serve both God and money. When God is the great identifier of our souls, when God is the God who gives us purpose, you can't serve both God and money. 1 Timothy 6:10 and 17 and 18 says this, the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. And some people, craving money, have wandered from the true faith and pierced themselves with many sorrows. Command those who are rich, therefore, in this present world, not to be arrogant or to put their hope in wealth, which is so uncertain, but to put their hope in God, who gave us everything for our enjoyment. Giving and generosity is the only antidote to materialism. And money may seem sure, but it is fleeting. It's fleeting with the stock market. It's fleeting due to recession and inflation. It doesn't last. We need money to survive, right? But it cannot be. This love of money is the root of all evil, and we cannot put our hope and our faith in money. We put our hope and our faith in God, and giving, generosity is the only antidote to materialism. And last, my mentor assured, generosity forms us more like Jesus. It forms us more like Jesus. When we live generously, we begin to look more and more like Jesus. You look at Jesus, and Jesus was a giver. When we are generous, we start to place our hope and our faith in God. Proverbs 21:26 says, "The greedy always want more, but the godly love to give." The greedy always want more, but the godly love to give. Maybe this is why generosity is so hard to make a habit. Greed. We always want more. We're always looking to build bigger and better. We're always looking to acquire more and more and more. To look at the next guy and make sure we have more than them. To compare ourselves. Greed. I love that proverb. The greedy always want more, but the godly love to give. And when we look at Jesus, we see a giver. We see someone interested in the needs of others. We see someone who has this deepening faith. And Jesus talked about generosity. Jesus talked about money so much. And yet we have this like weird relationship when we talk about money, especially in church. If you come to church, you're like, I would rather talk about sex. I would rather talk about politics. I would rather talk about end times. I would rather talk about anything else going on in the world. I do not want to talk about money. Why does it feel so personal and intrusive and intimate? Why does it feel like it's almost, it's taboo? Why does generosity and giving feel like this? Maybe you've had a bad experience in the church with money. I get it. Maybe you were raised in a prosperity gospel. Maybe you have a skepticism. I get it. But I think that we often feel uncomfortable talking about generosity and money because generosity is a heart issue. It's a heart issue. That's why Jesus talks about money almost more than anything else in his ministry. That's why Jesus talks about money, because it's a heart issue. He talks about money because it is often the thing that we trust in the most. It's the thing that we put in front of God the most. It's the thing that we feel like we can fall back on. Jesus knows that generosity is a heart issue, and generosity forms us, and generosity requires trust. It requires trust in God in a way that seems counterintuitive, countercultural, and almost scary. Can I ask you, at the core of who you are, what do you trust in most? Do you trust in your bank account? Do you trust in the house that you can show everyone? What do you trust in the most? That's why Jesus talks about money. He says, I want you to trust God most. There's this interaction with Jesus found in Matthew chapter 14 that paints a powerful picture and a practical picture of the practice of generosity. And I want to walk through it together. And here's the scene. Jesus has spent some time alone. He has just learned that his cousin, John the Baptist, has been murdered by some power-hungry elitists of the day. Jesus gets the news that his cousin has been killed, and he heads off. He just wants to be alone. So he gets in a boat, and he's been praying, and he's been grieving, and he's been anguishing over losing a family member. And we pick up this story in verse 13, and it's going to show us the power of generosity, the power of trust. I'm going to walk through it with our remaining time together. It says this: as soon as Jesus heard the news, he left in a boat to a remote area to be alone. He hears about John the Baptist, he goes to be alone. But the crowds heard where he was headed and followed on foot from many towns. Verse 14. Jesus saw the huge crowd as he stepped from the boat, and he had compassion on them, and he healed their sick. The evening came, and the disciples who were with Jesus came to Jesus and said, Jesus, this is a remote place, and it's already getting late. Send the crowds away so they can go to the villages and buy food for themselves. Now get this picture. Jesus is grieved, and he gets off the boat, and he sees the crowds, and he still gives. He still has compassion on them, and he heals their sick even in the midst of his pain, even in the midst of his agony, he took time to pray with them. He stepped off the boat and straight into their burdens. Even though he was burdened, he still gave. Why? Because God is a giver. The disciples, on the other hand, are spent. They see the masses and it's getting late and they see all of the need. They see Jesus meeting all the need. They seem to be getting tired of watching Jesus continue to give. So they come to Jesus and they suggest this great plan. Okay, send them home so that they can buy food for themselves. Send them home so that they can go take care of themselves. We've taken care of enough. And watch what Jesus does. Jesus is about to teach them something about the transformational power of generosity. He said, but Jesus said to them, it isn't necessary to send them away. You feed them. But we only have 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, the disciples answered. Jesus turns to them after they suggest to send the crowds away so that they can feed themselves. And Jesus turns to them and he says, you feed them. You give them something to eat. Jesus seems to command to put a responsibility on the disciples. If they're hungry, Jesus says, you feed them. Jesus challenges both the compassion and the faith of the disciples. And he says, I want you to see the need, and I now want you to rise to the occasion to meet it. I want you to actually feed them. One Sunday after service, several months ago, I had a really nice person come up to me, and they kind of came a little intense, and they said, hey, I want to know, what are you and what's the church going to do about the homelessness and all the needs of the city? I want to know what you're going to do about it. What are you going to do about it? And I was like kind of taken aback a little bit, but I responded with kindness and with patience, and I explained our one-for-one initiatives. I explained how we partner with local organizations that really meet needs. As a church, that we continue to do this. We have a benevolence fund. We meet with people almost every week, helping with rent and car repair and all of these different things. And then I felt this nudge in my spirit to ask a pretty personal question of this person. I said, that's what we're doing, and we can do more. We can always do more. But then I said, but what are you going to do about it? What are you doing about it? See, we have this mentality, maybe in the Western world, definitely in the American church, where we can show up to church or we can show up to an organization and we can demand that that organization or that thing or that entity or those other people actually take care of the needs. We can trust the government. We can say the government needs to be doing this. And Jesus looks at every single one of us if we follow Jesus and he says, well, what about you? Why don't you feed them? He gives the disciples, and he gives us a responsibility. Jesus says, okay, you've been seeing me give. Now it's time for you to engage. You can't just trust me to do this all the time. I'm telling you to feed them. I'm telling you to show up, you to be compassionate, you to give, you to serve, you meet the need. And you can almost see this look on the faces of the disciples when he says this, because they respond with, but all we have is this. Right? They say, but we only have 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. What a typical response. Have you found that in your life? When somebody asks you to do something, you're like, but I don't have enough time. But I don't have what it takes. Man, that's a pretty typical response, but we only have. But Jesus, the need is too great. But Jesus, there's too many people, and it's just us. Can I ask you really quickly, because this is what we're going to see in this story. What are the buts in your life that keep you back from seeing God bless others through your generosity? But God, I don't have what other people have. But God, I only make this much. Only this much is in my bank account. But God, I have this car payment and I have this debt. But God, I only have 4 kids and they want to play sports. But God, I'm just a college student. But God, I earned this myself. It's mine. But God, what if I don't have enough left over for myself? Or what if they don't spend it like that? But God, what happens? What happens if what I give doesn't even make a dent? But God, what if I'm not enough? What if it's not enough? Have you found yourself wanting to be generous, but I only have gets in the way? Jesus is about to show the disciples, and Jesus is about to show you and me that what we have is more than enough in his hands. Look at verse 18. Jesus says, bring them here to me. 5 loaves, 2 fish. He said, bring them here to me. Then he told the people to sit down in the grass, and Jesus took the 5 loaves and the 2 fish. He looked toward heaven and he blessed them. And then breaking the loaves into pieces, he gave the bread to his disciples, who distributed it to the people. Jesus says, I know that's all you have, but we only have 5 loaves and 2 fish. But what does Jesus say? He says, bring it to me. Just bring it to me. Bring me what you have. Bring me all you have. Bring me only what you have. And they give it to Jesus. They bring it to Jesus. And get this, why are they giving it to Jesus? Why are they giving all that they have to Jesus in this moment? But we only have. Why are they putting it in his hands? This past year, my daughter had a toy that fell off the top, like up from above the stairs, fell down the stairs and broke into like what seemed to be a million pieces. And she cried and she picked up the pieces and she struggled and worked so hard for a few minutes to try and make sense of it and put it all back together. And then I'll never forget this. She had this broken toy and she simply just brought it to me and she said, Dad, can I give this to you? Why was she doing that? She put it in my hands. Why? Because she trusted me with it. Well, I'll never forget when my parents divorced and my mom was left with a house and a load of bills and hoops to figure out with kids and future college and money that she did have and money that she didn't have. And I'll never forget her calling my granddad. My granddad came over to the house and she just asked him for help. She put a lot of it in his hands, a lot of the need, a lot of responsibility, a lot of the burden in his hands. Why? Because she trusted him with it. The disciples have been commanded to feed the hungry. Jesus said, you feed them, and they look at what they have, and then they say, I don't know what to do with this, and so they bring it and they put it in Jesus' hands. Why? Because they trusted him with it. They have seen Jesus' character. They have seen his integrity. They have seen his compassion. They have seen the amazing work that he was able to do. And they know that when we bring it to Jesus, when they put it in his hands, it is the most trustworthy place to bring what they have. To bring what we have. And man, I had a friend who used to say, he did a lot of work in Haiti, and he said, God can take who you are and what you have and do more than you could imagine when you trust him with it. God can take who you are and what you have and do more than you could ever ask or imagine when you put it in his hands and when you trust him with it. Do you believe this? This is key. God can do so much with your little. When we bring what's in our pockets, when we bring what's in our hearts, when we bring what's in our minds and we bring it to God, and we trust him with it, do you believe that he can do more than you could ever dream of? Man, this is key. Stocks are fine, right? Real estate is great, right? Sneakers are great. Kids' sports, fantastic. But what would change in your life and in mine when we brought who we were and what we have and we brought it to Jesus? What would happen if we trusted him in a way that said, Jesus, I'm giving this to you because I trust you with it. I trust that you're able to do more, and I trust that you're able to bless through it. They bring it to Jesus. Jesus takes the offering, and he looks to heaven, and he blesses it, and he breaks it. Jesus takes it, and he blesses it, and he looks up towards heaven, and he blesses the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and then he breaks the loaves into pieces. Really quickly, there is something about generosity. There is something about giving that lifts our eyes to heaven. Jesus looks to heaven and he blesses the gift. There is something that happens when you and I give that turns our thinking to less temporary and more eternal. Less temporal, more eternal, more heavenward thinking. Have you noticed that? That when you're generous, you're more grateful. That when you're generous, you're more at peace. That when you're generous, you're more focused on your purpose. You are thinking, you're not looking. Money has a way of making us look down and like count constantly all of the things that we have and hoard and compare and look down. But generosity has a way of lifting up our eyes and looking out and beyond to the blessing that is possible when our gifts, when our giving are placed in God's hands. And then watch what happens when they bring it to Jesus and he blesses it and he breaks it. He says, I want you to distribute this to all the people. And something incredible happens. Verse 20, they all ate as much as they wanted. And afterward, the disciples picked up 12 baskets of leftovers. That day, about 5,000 men were fed, in addition to all the women and children. Get this. 5,000 men and their families ate their full when someone brought 5 loaves and 2 fish, and there were 12 baskets of leftovers. That doesn't make sense. Jesus gives it. And I want you to get this. When Jesus gives, when Jesus takes our gift and gives it back, there is an abundance. The generosity of the disciples, the generosity when they brought it to God and when they trusted in God with just what they had, but we only have this. Jesus took it and turned it into an abundant blessing that blessed 5,000 plus people, and there were leftovers for them. There was an abundance. See, when we give, God multiplies the gifts. This isn't a prosperity gospel, but when we give to God, when we bring our time, our talents, our attention, our treasure, and we bring it to Jesus, God multiplies the gift. He takes what we have and what we give, and it becomes something bigger and beyond anything that we thought possible. There's a blessing in the giving. Have you found that to be true in your life? I have a good friend who came into a time in his life where he just felt led to give above and beyond what he had kind of budgeted. He saw a need and he saw a family in dire need, and they said, we are going to take on their rent for the next 3 months. And it didn't make sense financially. They prayed about it. They were sweating about it, but they risked it and they gave generously. And my friend told me, he said, I can't even explain the ways that God blessed us in return. And the blessing wasn't financial achievement. It wasn't financial abundance, but it was this spiritual contentment, this peace, this joy that we had, that our life was doing, our life, our time, our money, our talents, our attention, were doing more than we could ever ask or imagine. This is what happens. There is an abundance that God provides when you and I are generous. And again, it's not always financial. Sometimes it is. A lot of times it's relational, emotional, spiritual. It's holistic. God brings an abundance in our life. And so, man, how does this hit you? How have you seen the transformational power of generosity in your life? And how are you wrestling with this? How are you wrestling with this? May we be a generous people, a generous church, by installing the habit of generosity, by bringing what we have to Jesus. May we make that a habit. 2 Corinthians 9, 6 and 8 says this, each of you should give what you have decided in your heart to give, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. And God is able to bless you abundantly so that in all things, at all times, having all that you need, you will abound in every good work. Let me ask, what have you decided to give? What does this look like for you and for me? For me and our family, it's meant tithing our first 10% regardless of what we make. It's setting aside that first 10%, and it's meant giving it to the local church, giving it back to SLO City. And it's been like that since we've come to know Jesus and been married. It's been foundational. And sometimes it doesn't make sense, but we believe in the local church, and we believe that the local church is where God calls us to invest. And so we start there, and we trust that God will bless and will multiply that gift. We'll do more with that gift than we could, and God will provide, and God has provided. That's been a baseline for me and my family. Maybe that's a step for you. For the church, it means caring more about works of compassion and actually being generous in our city than it means caring about comfort or getting more attention, right? It's more about bringing hope to real people and meeting tangible needs of real people in our city. So as a church, we're only 3 years old, but we have committed to giving a minimum from the start of 15% away to local and global nonprofits. Now, I've had some say, you don't have to do this. You don't have to do this. It's not expected of a church your age, your size, to give away 15%, especially early on. But we desire to be a generous church, and we actually believe that generosity is transformational. It does transformational work in the community, in ministry, in the life of our church, but it does transformational things in our hearts as well. It is forming us, this church, this collection of people, to look more like Jesus. And can I tell you, God has blessed, God has multiplied, God has provided for this little church in San Luis Obispo in a radical way. In a radical way. What does it mean for you to install the habit of generosity? Has this felt personal to you? Has this felt a little intimate? I think that's a good thing. We should wrestle with what we do with our time, what we do with our talent, and how we handle our money, and what we give to. Can I tell you that generosity is transformational? We will be a generous church. We're going to continue to be generous and continue to trust God, bring what we have to him and say, do what only you can do. The question is, will you? Will you? I love this quote from Jim Rohn. He says, only by giving are you able to receive more than you already have. Only by giving are you able to receive more than you already have. Why? Because when our hands are open and empty from being generous and bringing what we have, there's room to receive. There's room to receive. May we be generous people, a generous church, and being transformed by generosity to look more like Jesus, who came and gave up his life, was generous to the point of dying on a cross for our sin and our shame, who was beyond generous with his love and his goodness, who is beyond generous in the way that he blesses us. May we respond by looking and living generously like Jesus. Father, we love you and we thank you for today. Give us the courage to be compassionate, to trust, to search our hearts and to weigh our motives and to place all that we have in your hands. God, give us the courage to take the next best step. It's in Jesus' name, amen.